I'm privileged to introduce myself. I'm Steve Piltch. I have the pleasure of being the head of school at Shipley, and I'm in my 23rd year, and I've said this many times for people who know this. Gesu has rapidly become my second favorite school in the city. It's a wonderful place. And by the way, Andre, just as a point, I didn't happen to go to Catholic day school, but when Sister Ellen comes by, I sit up straight too. So that's the piece. I'd like to begin by thanking Andre and all the people who were part of the film for telling a story that we all know to be far truer than we'd like it to be. And while I'm deeply pleased that from Andre's perspective, that we've moved things from a place of noticing it to at least being able to speak to them from a systematic perspective, it's clear that we all have lots to do before we get to the time that students from different backgrounds can come together, each of whom is appreciated for the person she or he is, so that all of them can thrive in the way that we as parents, educators, and people would like them to. I'm happy to say I'm joined on stage here by 5 wonderful colleagues who will have some great comments about how we might be able to get there. As I set the tone for that, what I want to say is I'm going to begin by asking them a series of questions, each of them, and as I introduce them, and I'll really only speak to their names, I'm going to ask each of them to say a little bit about himself, herself, before answering the question that I pose. And it might not look like it, because I'm not going to go in the exact order that we're at, but there is rhyme and reason to the order that I will go. But will you join me, first of all, in thanking Andre for sharing that story? It was really wonderful. So let me also say that when we finish the first round of questions, we're going to open this, obviously, I hope it's obvious, to the community, to all of you, to be able to ask those questions, and so that we can have an exchange here that makes some sense. So I'm going to begin with Daryl, if that's okay, and I'm going to let you comment in just a minute, but I have to say this, is that for those who don't know it, and I hope everybody does, I want us to give him a special round of applause as we welcome back this wonderful Gesu alum. Class of 94?
Sorry?
Class of 94 here?
I'm sorry.
What class?
94.
94.
Yep.
You're looking pretty good.
Thank you.
Okay, so here we go. Daryl, you're somebody who went to Gesu.
Yep.
Then, if I remember, you went off, you went right next door for a bit, but you wound up graduating from Westtown.
Yep.
So as you reflect on the story told by Andre, one, what pieces of it can you connect with? What observations have you made as you've gone through high school, obviously through college, and a wonderfully successful business career? And suggestions could you make in this moment in response to what was said?
Great. So first of all, great job on the movie. And I want to take a moment to just say, I'm not just a graduate of Gesu, but every day when I walk into J.B. Morgan Chase to go to work, it's because of Gesu that I'm able to walk into that building and sit in the role that I have today and have the life that I have. And that's mainly due to Gesu, but mostly to Sister Ellen and Father Neil. So I just want to say thank you for everything.
Yes.
I love you. So when I looked at the movie, I had mixed feelings. One, I said, well, this wasn't my experience, and should it have been my experience, and did I sleep through high school? Because I didn't experience this. I had a relatively positive experience at Westtown Friends. But then there were parts of the movie where I could relate to. So when I would come back to North Philly, having been at Westtown, which was a boarding school, I would get from my friends, oh, you sound white, you're not hard enough anymore, you forgot where you come from. But when I would go back to Westtown, I was in a world that exposed me to diversity, to difference. I met African Americans who were upper middle class. I met African Americans who were low to moderate income. But I was in an environment that was supportive, that was positive, and I would say, having spent a stint across the yard at St. Joe's Prep, and I don't think this comment represents the school, but maybe that one individual. But I remember sitting with a counselor at the prep, and he said to me, "You're tall." And I said, "Yeah." And he says, "Do you play basketball?" And I said, no. And he says, you know, Roman Catholic gets all the black athletes, the prep gets all the black nerds. And to me, that was like, what do you mean? It's okay to be smart, because Gesu had told me that, Daryl, it's okay to be smart. And so when I went to Westtown, my experience was totally different. And I'll tell you a funny story. I had never played basketball, but again, the coach saw me walking down the hall and said, you're tall. And I said, yes. And he says, do you play basketball? And I said, no. And he says, well, we can teach you. And so I remember my first basketball game, and if you know anything about basketball, on defense they have this 3-second rule. You can't stay in the paint for more than 3 seconds. I didn't know any better. I was told to stand there, be tall, you'll block balls. And so I kept getting this penalty. So finally the ref kept saying every 3 seconds, 3 seconds, big guy, 3 seconds, big guy. And that was how I knew to move out the paint. But what that story shows is that at Westtown, because I was tall and I was black and I was from North Philly, didn't necessarily mean that I had to play basketball. But if I wanted to play, it was an environment where I can try and can learn. My sophomore year, I was student class president. I looked at the black table. There really wasn't the black table. And so, a couple of things. You asked is, you know, I hadn't viewed the movie before I got here, but I kind of had this expectation that it was going to be what it was. And so I reached out to some of my classmates at Westtown of color. We're still connected thanks to Facebook. And I said, what was your experience like at Westtown? And they all had positive experiences, to the point that one said, you know, I have a son, and he's going into his freshman year at Westtown because the same scholarship program that got me to Westtown is now getting him to Westtown. And so I would say that my experience at Westtown was very positive. It was a moment in my life that helped continue my upward trajectory, and that I did struggle with the family members and friends when I came back to North Philly who would criticize me for not being quote unquote black enough because I read books or was interested about learning or thought about college. So that was kind of my experience.
That's a great start for us. By the way, interesting that you're defined as either a nerd or a basketball player. Mm-hmm. Henry Fairfax would like to think he'd be both smart and a basketball player. Yeah. He's certainly one of those people.
Right.
So with that in mind, with what you've heard in the film and what Daryl's just shared, Eileen and Henry, as two people who are in schools now, recognizing the challenges that we have, I mean, this needs to be a shared responsibility, as Andre put so articulately, and everybody agrees. What are the things that you're observing? What are the things we're trying to do to get there? And Eileen, how about if you go first?
Sure. I would say I've been at Mary and Mercy for many, many years, and have really watched, as the admissions director, kind of a changing dynamic in terms of the number of families who are reaching out to us, and the number of key people in schools like the Gesu School who identify students who really would thrive in a private education and are really coming to us more than ever, rather than it being a job finding those students. We're fortunate to be geographically in a great location for families to be able to get to us, but it has been really interesting to me. The other thing I see over the last 5 or 6 years is more and more families that are more, both, you know, families of color that are coming from multiple segments socioeconomically, so that, you know, more and more we're seeing families that value the education that couldn't possibly afford it, families who can afford it and are coming or need a lot less help. And it's becoming, and I think this is ultimately what it needs to be, very normal to have a school filled with minority students, and not always just the special circumstance or, you know, someone that students might feel sorry for in some way or something to that, but just be, you know, a situation where more and more families feel entitled to that education, and if they need help, we'll find a way to help them. But the parent support and the parent interest, and I think Andre said that, just that simple day that his mother said, this isn't good enough. is happening more and more and more, and we're seeing that. You know, I come to the high school night here, and it's the biggest high school night I attend. And the numbers of parents and families that are interested in having their children attend a school like Mary is overwhelming to me.
So across the board, we're seeing our schools become more diverse in lots of different ways.
Right.
And yet, there's still the challenge to deal with the isolation that students might feel. We're working harder at it.
Absolutely.
We need to partner, but we're making progress as part of what you're suggesting.
Right, so I would just like to add that something we have done at Marion is, I think what our biggest concern is always that transition, and how will the student come to us and feel at home as quickly as possible and feel up to par academically, or be ready for the workload. So we actually started a program about 7 years ago where we reach out to many of our partners in the inner city schools, ask them to recommend the Catherine Drexel program to their students who are students who really work hard and have a great work ethic and would like to be in a private school at some point. Those students come to us every Saturday for the entire 2 years in their uniforms on Saturday morning for 4 hours for math enrichment, writing enrichment, and then we have our teachers do different classes with them at the high school level. What that has done, and then in the summer we scholarship many of those kids to our summer program where it's a mixed group of students, not just students of color. And what that has done is have our girls start as freshmen, number one, being really well prepared for the academics that they're going to face, and number two, with a group of friends that they start school with and already feel a part of. They know our building, they feel comfortable there. So it was a matter of kind of taking what we are and making them feel comfortable with it before that first day of school ever began. But I don't underestimate still the transition. I kept looking at the book bags in the movie and thinking, those girls carry 2 book bags every day. You know, they carry their school books and they carry their other life. And some of it is perfectly happy and fine and well adjusted, and many of them are carrying stories that are unbelievable.
So the code switching that sometimes happens for some, we'll come to that. Henry, I've had the privilege to know you now for really almost 20 years. And Henry was a student at the Haverford School before going off and having a wonderful college career and coming back to the area where he's now the director of admissions. I know I filled that in. But he brings a fuller, a different perspective as someone who lived it as a student and now has come back to help have a role in improving what we do. Henry.
Thank you. First thing I want to do is ask Daryl the number to the referee that gave you all those calls and told you to get out of the lane. I don't have those refs. Anyway, Steve's right. I attack this from a totally different perspective, or a unique perspective, in that I attended the Haverford School as a student, was really eyewitness to an achievement gap, didn't know that all schools were different, that you can have access to excellence, and I kind of staked my career on initially saying, I want to create access. And the more I live this work, the more I realize what I really want to be able to do is create access to excellence. And so, in my role as head of admissions and head basketball coach, I've been fortunate to be awarded a classroom. And I see the basketball coaching piece as a classroom. And as I listened to the comments of the different panelists, I had an idea a couple of years ago to have a couple of the students, or all of the students that played for me, to do something different. And it was a little daring on my part, and the idea was something that I thought about after having seen Andre's film. He doesn't know this, so I'm going to embarrass him for a second. I felt like, and the film resonated with me so much, I thought it was such a courageous effort, but yet what were we doing at the ground level in our work as educators to allow these experiences to happen in an authentic way? And so I started coaching in 2010, and I decided to have all of the students pair up with a partner, and you had to visit a different house. The idea was, and I thought deeply on this, diversity it should be a fair exchange. And I remember being in high school and always going to the rich kid's house. And my mom one day said, well, they're gonna have to come over here at some point. And so what we do on the basketball team, the very first assignment, if you will, aside from having to jump to the ball and come off down screens and all that fun stuff, the first thing we do is we pair all of the students up and say, you have to go to the, such and such's house from Bryn Mawr. A student from Bryn Mawr has to visit a kid from Northeast Philadelphia. A kid from Gladwin has to visit with a kid from Upper Darby, or whatever the case may be. And what happens is that fair exchange. And I wonder if we did more things like that in our educational spaces, what the response, what Andre's film might look like. And so, I think it's really important to think creatively, think out of the box on how we can do things in our own individual spaces to really create that authentic engagement.
Thanks. Howard Stevenson, for your entire career, you've worked with people on issues of diversity. Certainly in the years I've had the privilege to be here, you've spent a lot of time with our schools, helping us understand issues of diversity, helping us become better partners, helping us become the kinds of schools I think you'd like to see us become. Share with the people here the observations you've made over the years and some suggestions that you would have for all of us. Please.
Well, I also like to thank Andre. This is like the fourth time I've seen the movie, and each time I feel touched by your integration of both community and where I'm from with how I navigate a different world. And in the experience I've had with different schools, I find this is a major dilemma, and that there is often a red herring about stereotype, racial stereotype, about whether you're smart or not, whether you're athletic or not, and that these are distractions in reality. And in whether someone decides not to deal with these sort of matters, it steals something from your talent, from your ability to navigate what I think of as a bigger challenge in the world. And it's not whether you're a good person or a bad person, it's not whether you're a smart person or you're challenged and struggling with learning. It's about whether you know how to navigate stress, and racial stress in particular, in face-to-face relationships. In a lot of ways, schools are struggling because when I get asked to come, it's usually because a conflict has occurred. And in many respects, the stress, it doesn't really matter if it comes from the school or the community. In some respects, the idea that people who look like you still challenge your existence, challenge your right to be where you are, still brings racial stress. Somebody that doesn't look like you may challenge your right to be where you are. That still brings about racial stress. And so where I think what Andre was saying earlier about, to what degree does your heart and mind go together? Schools, I think, are very much interested around both heart and mind to begin a journey around racial justice. But the ideas of racial justice. But where I think the challenge is how do you continue that battle when there are conflicts, that we don't always know how, with our heart and mind, to actually navigate a conflict around not just an ideal about racial justice, but what do I do and say with this young person in front of me who's different? Different in how they are styled, different in how they walk, different in how they talk, that these become what I think are the better stages by which we judge what I would call a racial literacy. How well do I know how to navigate a stressful moment where my difference is on trial? And so I believe schools really want to deal with this, but I think the struggle is what do I do and say? What skills do I need to develop to actually speak up in algebra, right? To speak up if I'm the only one. And we're finding right now that not only students of color are struggling to speak up in classrooms, where you do get, the notion of learning, but also faculty members who are also different are stressed by the burden of what other people will think of me because of my difference. And so this takes us away from a symbolic notion of racial justice, an idealistic notion of racial justice, and more to one around how do I navigate, speak, talk, stand up in a face-to-face interaction. And in that sense, I think there's a lot more work to do. And while the heart and mind is there to begin that journey, the actual basic skills of what do I do when someone's in front of me, it's still the work we have left.
It's one of the reasons so many schools in other places are now being trained in how you have the hard conversation, whatever that means. But as Andre was good enough to tell, that conflict can occur not just in school, but also within the family. And that sometimes the conflict is not as well expressed or articulate as we know until years later. So Andre, in that context, as you listen to the people here and you think about the story you've told, are you sitting there with optimism that in the future, we'll go further, it might be a different, better story or easier story? I'm not sure of the right adjective, but you know what I'm saying.
I'll start by saying I'm very optimistic. You know, it's been very interesting to take this film around, and I'm always excited when I see Henry, because I remember that after the first screening at POCC, this is probably the 4th time I showed the film to an audience, Henry made a beeline for me and cornered me against the wall, and he's tall, you know, and he's like, let's talk about your movie. And we had a really intense and wonderful conversation about the need and the stresses and the differences and the difficulty. And it was one of those moments where I was like, this film might mean something to people, and that stayed with me. So I appreciate that moment, Henry, and I love the work that you're doing. And I'll stress by saying I'm so honored to be amongst all of you on this panel, because you have some impressive stories, which are great to hear. And I'm extremely optimistic. I'll tell one story that really did it for me. I was invited to speak at the Episcopal School of Dallas, and I remember thinking, what do they want with the prep school of Negro? You know, this is the school the Bush twins attended, and I thought, oh, this is going to be a rough experience. And I went, and I walked in, and I saw a teacher sitting there like this when I walked in the door. And by the end, his arms were open because he saw this is more of a human story. It wasn't another moment where he, as is often been said, being forced to talk about the race problem, you know. It was, we as humans have to figure out how to treat each other better. So I feel very optimistic in the sense that I went back to the school a year later, and been back 3 times, and they were preaching some of the ideas that I had dropped and landed there.
So 2 quick things on that. One, it's good that we're optimistic and we're moving forward, because if we're not getting better, we're getting worse. But the second thing that I think Henry already said in terms of the film and these discussions, and certainly Professor Stevens talks about this all the time, for those who saw this for a first time, each and every time you see it, it will have a different and more important impact in a whole different way, particularly as we can connect with it ourselves. At this point, I'd love it if we could open the floor to a question or two. I wish we had lots more time, but we have a few minutes. We're okay? A question for anybody? Please, I don't know your name, but go ahead.